Okay, so we're just setting up a connection here with Dion right now, so we'll get started shortly. But in the meantime, please go ahead and start typing in your questions. This is a questions-driven webinar. See, we have at least one person who's typed something in. But go ahead and type them into the questions box of the GoToWebinar interface. We will officially get started, like I said, in about 30 seconds or so.
Yep, ready to go whenever you are.
Excellent. There you are. Well, hello and welcome everyone to the Alpha Anywhere demo and Q&A. I'm Dave McCormick here in the very cold city of Boston, Massachusetts, here at Alpha headquarters. And I'm pleased to be joined by Dion McCormick, no relation, down in Austin, Texas. Today we are going to be going over some Alpha Anywhere concepts, but we'll also, and more importantly, be answering your questions. So go ahead and type your questions into the questions box of the GoToWebinar interface. Now, before we get started, just one thing you need to know, and that is that this session is being recorded, and you'll be able to find a copy of this and the other webinars at videos.alphasoftware.com. So let's begin. Dion, are you still there?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. Let me go ahead and make you the presenter. Okay, you should be seeing a dialog box. And I can see your screen.
Great. We might have a little bit of a slow network today, but we'll continue going from there. Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule. As Dave had mentioned, this is about you, so if you can take a few moments, and if you have any questions, whether they're new questions or experienced, go to your GoToWebinar control panel and input it into the questions area. Dave will be monitoring that and lining them up for discussions. So what we're going to do today is, obviously questions are high priority, but I wanted to go ahead and continue our discussion before the break. We've had a little break here, and we were talking about events and the event structure. And I wanted to share with everybody, we really appreciate, this was actually a question that came from one of our attendees previously. So we had a number of people who were asking about that, and they put their in, so we were able to build this content to bring to you. Now, as we talked about before the break, we're going to finish up these in the next 1 or 2 sessions, but then we're going to start diving into some of the new capabilities in the tablet optimized forms coming out this year, because we really want to start getting our developers kind of getting their heads around what's available when, you know, we're anticipating Q1 delivery of the new Alpha system. So we're going to spend some time going over that, and we're putting together some really fun content so that you will be ahead of the curve when it's time and ready to go. So we're very excited. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and first check, Dave, coming through okay voice-wise?
Yep, you sure are. Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. So as we started before, we're talking about events. And specifically, there were 2 kinds of events that occur in an Alpha application. You have the server-side events, which occur on the Alpha server, and then there's the client-side events that takes place on either the desktop mobile, the desktop web, the mobile web browser, those pieces there. So within our system, there's really a very distinct line between the 2 in terms of where things happen. And there's certain capabilities in terms of what is available to you when both of them happen. And we had an example of this a couple weeks ago where we showed how even on client side, there's ways to look at server-side data using what's called a session variable publishing. And I'm not going to go through that again, but it's kind of, we want to really make sure you get an understanding of the terminology and how the pieces go. So again, when we talk client side, that's happening locally on either the web browser or the mobile phone or wherever it happens to be. It is nothing happening on the server side. And what's nice is client-side events are immediate, meaning it all gets processed right there. And the language is JavaScript, which happens on the client side. On the server side, this is where, if you're doing database lookups and other things like that, you will have events occurring on the server side that allow you a lot more sort of things you can do. And you can do that in XBasic or now Node.js, which we'll be spending some time on that a little later this quarter, also talking a bit there. So again, we want to make sure that you understand between the 2 that things like grids and UX components have a client side and a server side, and we can go through that. Now today, what I would like to do is I'm going to dive into what's called the server side. Let me scroll down to my things here. Bear with me real quick. Okay. I'm going to go through and show you some of the server-side events. Now, this isn't meant to be exhaustive. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I want to kind of give you some pointers and show you where kind of things are at so you have a little better familiarity with the tool. So in this case, what we're going to focus on is our UX component, and for people who are new to Alpha, the UX is our form component. Please note that grids also have server-side events. I won't cover those today, but they also, which last time, if you go back, actually it's in the Alpha video archives now, my previous presentation where I go into and talking about where grid server-side and event side are, and I'm sorry, client side are at. So if you get a chance, if it's a little confusing, the first part of this, just go back and check out the video. It's there for you to use. So what I want to go through is on the UX server-side event, we're basically building and displaying a form that has behaviors, meaning that it can interact with the user, it can respond to the user, and it is built, delivered to the device, and then handles things, and then sends the information back to the server. And that's what this picture is about, is that the reality is that when a browser mobile device requests a UX component, i.e. they request a form, like I want to fill out a registration card, or I want to fill out a database screen for a car, or whatever it happens to be, the server on the right-hand side will build that form for them, including the HTML5, the CSS, and the JavaScript, and then send that whole package of information down to the browser, which will then render it and create it on the screen for the user to interact with it. So the sort of the sequence of operation is that the browser requests a form or a grid, but in this case a form, a UX component. The server sits there and says, oh great, I've got to deliver this. So it pulls out the component, it builds it in a form that will essentially compiling it real time, and that will be working on the end device, and then it sends that back to the device, and then it represents it to the user. So there's some events that happen before the user ever sees that UX control. Now, once that UX control is on the local browser or mobile device, the user can interact with it. They can fill out fields. If there has been like validation real time, that you'll see some interactivity, like when you type out of a field, it will give you a little warning. But that's all that information has been kind of pre-compiled by the server and sent down to the UX. And then last but not least, what will happen is that the user will click submit or a submit type button, and then what the form will do is it will gather up all that information and then send all that back to the server. And then the server will analyze that information and then take action. So you have your events that occur before the UX goes down to the mobile device. Then you have your events that are happening on the mobile device, which is usually, as always, JavaScript events, which you could pre-code and have in there. And then what happens is then the form sends its data back up to the server and triggers another set of events that occur on the server. And those events allow you then to do validation and everything else, save the data into a database, do a bunch of different things from there. So what I'm going to talk about for the remainder of this little session here is what are those key events and what are they. I really won't have a chance to give actually show you some code, but I want to kind of know what the different ones are and what they mean. But again, the browser originally asked for a form, a UX component. The server builds it, does a bunch of stuff, sends it to the browser. The browser then works with it and interacts with the user. And then when the user submits the information from that form back to the server, it triggers another set of events. And that's what I like to call the life cycle for a UX or grid, because it gets born, it gets delivered, it gets interacted with, and then when it's finished with its done, it sends its information back up. Now you can have a situation where it stays and they keep communicating, but it has that life cycle process that goes on. So what are the key events? And you're going to see this in here. So what I'm going to do is here are the events, but real quick what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here to my demonstration and I'm going to create a new UX component. So bear with me. Okay, and if I go over to the server-side events, you'll see them there. Dave, real quick process check. Are the screens keeping up? Are you able to see now a open brand new UX?
Yep, I sure am, and I'm taking a look at the server-side events. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good. So log time or latency isn't too bad today.
Nope.
But you'll notice that in the UX control, which is our form control, you'll see we have server-side events, and in there we have a whole bunch of different server-side events. And actually, there's a description for each one of them that shows down here, and then also a whole bunch of documentation for each of the events to help you take advantage of it. So when you're in a UX, you have access to all these different events that can occur that allow you, or essentially hooks, to be able to interact and do things. Like when I go actually out and lay out the form, the system's going to automatically build that form, build the HTML, all that stuff for you. But if you want to take control in terms of other things you want to do, that's where these server-side events occur. So let me walk through what they are, and I'll walk through each individually, but you have on dialog initialize, you have on dialog execute, you have dialog validate, then you have after dialog validate, then you have what's called on dialog render, and on synchronize. Now I'm going to walk through each one of these and explain a little more detail on why you would go in and put things on these events, but those are the primary events there. Now, you may be asking yourself, why is it on dialog initialize and not on UX initialize? I mean, it's a UX component. If you're in the system, there you referred as UX. If you create a new one, it's not saying dialog anywhere. What's going on? And in fact, when you're inside here, you're going to see that it still refers to the term dialog inside the code often, and you'll see that also in the JavaScript. Well, here's the answer, is that, oops, don't want to delete it. Here's your answer. When the UX component was introduced originally, it was originally called a dialog component. So that was the original name for it. And so, I think it was V10, V11, I forget, Dave might be able to let me know. We introduced this new concept of basically a web-based form, and it was called dialog. But we soon realized that there's a downside to that. First and foremost is that dialog has sort of a kind of is associated with desktop applications, like you have a closed dialog, an open dialog, etc. So it has somewhat of a desktop metaphor, and the reality is Alpha came from a desktop world, so that's where that kind of terminology came in. If you're thinking about web solutions, we tend to think about what are called user experiences, i.e. they're presented with information. It's not just a pop-up with answer a couple questions, click OK, cancel. It's a much richer experience, and our forms, our UXs, can create incredibly complicated, incredibly beautiful forms. And so it realized after the first releases, like, let's really call this a UX because it's more, it really makes more sense for the web world from there. So don't get confused. Whenever you see dialogue, think UX and vice versa. It's just a terminology issue, and you won't have any of those issues there. So with that, let me go ahead and dive into it. I'm going to go ahead and dive into first on dialog initialize. Okay. So don't get confused, I have the server over here and the web browser, or the end device here. So when on dialog initialize runs is when the first time that that UX is requested or run on the server, i.e. a web browser says, give me this UX control. And so the system will say, hey, you know what, I have not delivered this UX control to that client, so I'm going to go ahead and initialize that dialog or UX component, and bear with me as I'll try to use UX through all this, to present to them. So that's that very first, I'm getting ready to go, I need to build up the forms, I need to build up the HTML, JavaScript, and I give the opportunity of the programmer to do some stuff before that is then delivered to the web client. So think about it, it's, when it's born, the moment it's born, you've got a chance in there to alter what you're going to do in terms of before it's delivered to the client out in the field. Now, something very similar to that is our next server-side event, which is on dialog execute. Now, this is different. This fires every time the UX executes, because the reality is after we have created that UX and sent it down to it, the client may talk back and forth to the server while still they have that form on the screen. And so what it does is that on dialog initialize will only fire one time. That's when you first build it, first deliver it. But every time you execute something on that, this on dialog execute will trigger. And this is very important for people as you get more sophisticated. If you're doing AJAX callbacks, every time an AJAX callback occurs, it's going to run this little this event so you can modify it. So this gives you a little bit more control to say, even after I have delivered my UX component to the client, I still have the opportunity to make some tweaks and adjusts every time the client interacts with that, because the UX kind of keeps the state information over here, and it keeps talking back and forth, because you may have like a grid where you're sitting there and you open up a grid, you start entering, every time you enter in and save information, it's going to send information back to the UX and back to the server, back and forth. So a UX or a grid may be opened up once and then used over and over before it's eventually closed out. So the big difference between them is that the onDialog initialize only does it one time, execute does it multiple times on both the first time it's run and on every AJAX callback. Gives you a lot more control in terms of if you want to check something every time you render that component. Now the next one is called Dialog Validate, and I've noticed that this doesn't get very used, and I'll show you which ones are the real critical ones for you to focus on. But this is the code that validates the data on the UX component that was submitted. So remember, we built up that UX control, we sent it down to the client started working with it, and then they sent submit, and then the client is going to take that information and send it back to the server, and the first thing the server is going to do is validate the data. Now, the beauty of the alpha system is when you define the different controls, you can put validation on it. In fact, let me go over here. I'm going to go to this. I'm in my UX component. I'm going to add a text box here. Okay, and on that text box right here, you'll see over here I have validation rules and validation XBasic. So this allows me to associate validation directly with this. And so when I set that up and do it, some is immediate, meaning it's done actually literally as the person's typing in the field. But other validation can be more complex, like where I want to check the value of this field and make sure it's in a database, or call a web service to make sure it makes sense, or something like that. Well, when the person submits this UX form back to the server, the first thing the server does is do the dialog validate. So often, since I've set it up there, I don't actually have to write any code. But this does give me a hook. If I want to do something super special, I can always trap it that when the data from that UX form comes back to the server, as it gets validated, I can do it. It's going to run its automatic ones that I've already associated with the controls for me, but then I can add it from there. So it's pretty powerful from there. I tend not to use this a whole lot because I can merely set the validation rules on all of these components as I build them, and it's much easier to manage, much more straightforward way to go. But there may be a situation where you want to do it elsewhere. Now, the next one is closely related to that. The next UX server-side event is the after dialog validate. And this fires after the data successfully validates. So after it's gone through this and everything's hunky-dory, it's cleaned up, everything's good, then it's going to go after dialog validate. And this is where I tend to put most of my code, because I know I've got a clean set of data. I can now update my database. I can now make some changes that I may want to and insert it in, or make changes, things like that. So this is, again, where I spend most of my time after the data has come back, because I can let the system validate and make sure everything's perfect before I want to take that data and then process it from there. So that's the after dialog validate. Next one is on dialog render. Now, let me go back to the life cycle of this. Let me go back to the server sides. You'll see that on dialog render is here. And render, I use it, and there's a very important reason why you use it, not as often. The ones I use the most, and I'll show you in a moment, are on dialog initialize, validate, after dialog validate. That's where the 90% of your code is going to be. But the on dialog render is really powerful, because what happens is, remember the life cycle is that the client makes a request to the server, and the server says, okay, yeah, I'll build this form for you. Now, you may want to be including some cool JavaScript or a JavaScript third-party library or something else. So it may be a situation where you want the full HTML, JavaScript, and CSS of the form built. Then you want to fire off or add a little JavaScript and other pieces there. So this is definitely an advanced topic, but this is very powerful, because when you start getting into using more and more JavaScript and other things like that to add third-party components and things like that, it allows you to use XBasic to modify the HTML or JavaScript. So the system is going to automatically build your form the way you designed it. But then I can say, hey, you know what, add these JavaScript events so that when it actually gets delivered to the client, that it shows the UX control and then it does a few other little things. And there are very specific situations where you may have this. And what I've found is what most people will often do is they'll put some stuff in OnDialog Initialize, like they'll want to run some JavaScript or do something like special on that, and it won't run. And for some reason, because of the way it's structured. Well, what I find often is that you build the form the regular way, or the UX the formula way, then you put that special HTML JavaScript in OnDialog Render, and it works fine from there because the system will essentially have a pre-built, ready-to-go form, and then you just kind of add on your secret sauce on top for there. Again, not used very often, but every once in a while, it's pretty valuable to have, and you'll be happy to have that there. And then the last one is called OnSynchronize, and this is a very interesting one here. The OnSynchronize is very similar to the OnDialog Execute, and here is where you would maybe use that. In our lifecycle, you will send a UX to the, or you'll send usually a UX to it, operate and go back. But sometimes what you'll do is the following, is for instance, you'll send a grid, and on that grid will be a button that says, open a UX to edit this record. And what will happen is that you'll essentially have both the grid and the UX open and available on the client at the same time. And so there is a way to, say, synchronize those two elements together when you open the grid or open the UX form from the grid. And so what this allows you to do is that the system will still trap when that person wants to synchronize those two items running on the client at one time and do that for you and allow you to then refresh some data or do something like that. Again, not used very often, but it's pretty cool to be able to have a couple different things on the system and be able to say every time it's given a synchronization to update and make sure everything works the same there. Again, I put them kind of in order of how often I use them, and this one isn't very nice. So if we look at the top level, the ones you're going to use most is OnDialog Initialize, AfterDialog Validate. Again, if you're getting a little more sophisticated, you may use OnSynchronize. The OnDialog Execute and Dialog Validate don't tend to use a whole lot, and the OnDialog Render, again, don't tend to use a lot unless you have a situation where you have this special JavaScript you need to run after the form has been built that may require something along those lines. So something to keep in mind from that standpoint there. So those are the ones there. Now I want to mention 3 other server-side events. I'm not going to go into detail on them, but if you'll notice in here we have before login, on login, and on logout. And so we have these 3 special type of integrated login events. Because you can, in certain controls, you can have what's called integrated login, where basically within that control you can then interface with the Alpha security environment to log in and log out. With that in mind, we need to be able to have the ability to say, on login, do something. And so we actually put that on the UX control. Now, most of the time, what people tend to do is they have a specific login page and login component, and all of that is handled there during that process there. But if you do have a situation where you want to make sort of a one component that does it all, sort of one ring to rule them all, you have these hooks in there so you can do on before login, on login, logout. Where you'll mainly see this behavior is, and I'll go back in here, is that when I create a new UX component here, and I pick a mobile app framework, let me go ahead and here, say the security framework logging component mobile app, and it will go ahead and build me an initial one here. This is where in here we notice we have a login and logout button, because the actual login behavior is going to actually occur right here, meaning that it's not going to go from here, go to another control. You're actually going to be staying right in this control. So in that situation, when you have login, logout, you need to have the ability to say on login, say set up the session variables or do some other things like that. And on logout, the same thing is when the person logs out of that one UX, you need to do your cleanup work and make sure everything is cleaned up and they're out of there nicely, that you've shut down session variables and things like that. So again, these will be mainly used if you are doing a mobile app, although you don't have to do a mobile app, but that's where I tend to see these going on a little there. And they're very, very easy to use, very straightforward from that standpoint. So let's go back. We have UX server-side events. It's the life cycle. It's when the UX is born, when it's sent there, when it talks back and forth to the server, and finally when it's done. And as you can see, there's a very rich set of server-side events you can use. It allows you to kind of basically intercept at every stage of that event to make modifications, changes, whatever you want to. It's very flexible. You won't find a situation where you won't be able to do what you need to do. The important thing to realize is that each of these right here are used at different time, although, as I've mentioned before, the ones you'll tend the most to use, actually I don't even really use this one a lot, is on dialog initialize and after dialog validate. If you see a lot of the videos that go through UXs, you'll see the kind of code there. And again, as I mentioned before, if you're in the system itself, you can click on one of these, you'll see a description here of what it does, and then over here you're going to see sample code of what kind of things you can do when you're in this event. Like for instance in the after dialog event, it shows you what can do. You can get access to the data that was submitted. You can get access to the data that was submitted or the old data before it was changed by the user. And then within that you can do a lot of manipulations and changes and alternatives there. So that is UX server-side events. Again, it's an introduction. Shows you the rich capabilities. There's a very similar set of server-side events for grids. They're actually even richer because there's a number of different things that grids do that UXs don't. That are available to you, so you can search those. Very similar situation. They have built-in documentation and other pieces there. But that is the second part of our, as I called it before, where was my opening there? My, oops, where did I put that? I guess I had it up here. Yep, our client-side, server-side event structures there. I'm probably going to do a wrap-up next week just to tie up a few loose ends. If there's any questions you had from my presentation this week, feel free to ask them now, or feel free to send them in to guides@alphasoftware.com. And Dave will be curating that, and we can come back and answer anything. If I've confused you or if you want any more detail, be glad to give you. But a very rich, very fun, very powerful set of tools so you can build essentially anything you would like to. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Dave, and Dave, take it away.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dion. So let's take a look at the questions. Now would be a great time to submit questions. We only have a handful so far, which is interesting because this is
Come on, people. It's New Year. Lots of new questions.
Best attended sessions. You know, I'm surprised that we have as many people as we do right now. So we're like at around 50 or 60 people right now. So I know there are more questions than that. They must have missed us. Anyway, let's start right at the beginning. Someone just asked quickly if the roadmap of the product from the 2015 DevCon is available. The answer is yes. I put the link to it in the chat area. I think I put it in the chat area. Let's see where else I would have put it. I may have put it in the questions area. I put it in the questions area, but the short answer is if you want to see any of the assets from the DevCon, you could find it at alphasoftware.com/devcon2015/resources.asp, and that has got PowerPoint presentations and all kinds of good stuff from the conference, including the roadmap of Alpha Anywhere.
Also, you know, in I think it was November or beginning December, we did a walkthrough of those roadmaps. So if you are curious about having more detail about that, we have a series of saved videos on the video library.
Absolutely, yeah. Actually, I was going to bring that up as well. Great, thank you. If you go to videos, if you go to no, I'm glad you reminded me. That would have slipped my mind. Videos.alphasoftware.com. If you take a look for the last, basically the December sessions that we did, all covered that. So that's a good place to look as well. So we have a technical question, and the question is on a scrollable grid component. Is there a way to dynamically check the number of rows that were found and we're going to get displayed, and then set the rows per page of the grid?
That's a really good question. Absolutely, you can determine the number of rows that are returned. And in fact, if we go back, I'm going to go into the system here, and I'm going to create a new component. So for people who are new, I'm in the Alpha development environment. I am at the Web Projects Control Panel, which shows me all my different projects or my different components that are available. I'm going to click New. I'm given the different types of components that are available. I'm going to click a Web component, and I'm going to click Grid. Before I was clicking UX, but now I'm going to click Grid. I'm going to click Next. I can have a number of different pieces there, so I can click OK, but those are templates. So as I mentioned before, what's happened is that when this grid runs, you set up the grid by setting up, and I might as well show people since there may be some new people. I have pre-built connections to different data sources. In this case, it's just a database, but coming soon we'll have web services and other OData sources, very, very powerful. So once I've set up that or pointed to my, my essentially data source, I can then say, hey, show me a list of tables. So for instance, I want a list of customers from this database. It could be views, etc., that are available. Then I can set filters, order bys, etc. But once I've done that, I can go to my fields, and then in here I can then go in here and add some fields into my there, and then I can go right into a working preview, and now I have a grid. It does all the presentation. You'll notice it's giving me the total number of records there, and you'll notice down below it's got a record navigator there. So the answer number one is that, well, how do I determine the number of records that came back? So in the server-side events, before it, there are ways inside of here to determine how many rows are going to be returned to the grid. So you're going to be using what we talked about before, those hooks, to be able to do what. And so you have, like, you know, like here, you gave an example. This event fires whenever the grid needs to get a count of number of records in the current grid. Well, since you know, when this fires, you can go in there and then store it and have availability to it. Now, that's question number one, is how do I determine the number of records? And you can read the documentation there that talks about how to do that. The second question is this, is that if I go to my properties, you'll notice that I have a property that says rows of data here. And we go to working preview, and you'll see that it's showing 10 rows of data here, but I can modify the number of rows here. The question is, and I'm probably going to have to do a little research, is that can I dynamically change this based on the number of records? Meaning, can I programmatically tell it, oh, in this case, use 25, and then it would automatically set that up there. So I would have to say I don't know on that part. I'd have to do a little research on that, see if that's capable of doing it there from that standpoint. So, and you'll notice that it's kind of got some pre-defaulted records per page template kind of things from that standpoint. So I'll take a look, I'll take a note and see what I can find out about that. But definitely you can get the number of rows by using your server-side events and grabbing in there to find out what the numbers of rows for this query will return. That's part one. Part two, I'll have to do a little research on how we can, if you can change the numbers of rows of data dynamically. My guess is there is a client-side event, and you can see we have tons of them here, that may be able to allow you to alter that setting, but again, I'd have to do a little research. That's probably beyond the scope of today's discussion.
Great, thank you. Next question is it possible to host an application on a corporate server? And if so, how easy is it to do this, and how secure is it?
That's a great question. Actually, we tend to find that's very secure, mainly because the server, and I'll go back to my pictures here, often what we find out is if it's a corporate server, it's inside a firewall. So all of this exists inside a firewall. So the answer is you'll use our standard Alpha server and you'll put it on a Windows server inside your corporate environment. And the Alpha server will then have a port. Say, a lot of times we use 8080. If it's not going to have IIS on that machine, you could actually set it as port 80. So once you've set that port, then that port is open for the clients to call to this server to talk to Alpha. And again, very powerful is that inside Alpha we have a full web security module, so you can actually say, well, even though you can connect to that port, unless you have the right credentials, you're not going to get access to the application details and the data behind it. So that's level number one. But often this whole situation inside a corporate environment is behind a firewall, so that this traffic is never going outside of the corporation. Now, we do have companies that actually do a mix of both. What they'll do is they'll have a server here that is inside the firewall, but they'll expose one of these ports through the firewall to the outside world. But I find most people, if they're very high secure, they'll actually have two Alpha servers, one for internal use and one for external use, so that even if anybody cracked and got access to this server for whatever reason, which we haven't any record of it at this point, but there's a lot of very smart hackers out there, that they can't even talk to the internal applications because they're on a separate server, and the only people who can access that internal is through this port here. So it's a bit long-winded, but the answer is yes. You would just set up a server inside your corporate firewall. You would set it up with the Alpha application server. You would open the specific port that's available, and then your clients just need to, your browsers just point to that that server and that port, and boom, you can then access the Alpha app server from there. And within that, you can fully enable the security system so that even though they can access the server, they still need to have credentials to be able to get inside to the application and start working it from there. Great question.
Excellent.
And if that didn't answer it, do a follow-up question.
And the follow-up question is, how easy is it to set this up as opposed to just how secure?
Actually, you know, it's really just a two-step process. First, this needs to be a Windows server, say 2008, 2012. Step one is you download from Alpha, or you've already been submitted the download link, the Alpha application server. This is a exe file that you put on your server and then you run. And it basically, it's like any installer, it will then install the software files on there and set it up. So that's step number one, is basically just like installing a desktop program. You click on the exe, you install it. Now, once it's installed, it is not running yet. It is just basically the files are on your server. So step two is there is it will ask you to put a link on the desktop to the application server, but when you double click on that link or on the underlying application server exe that's been installed, it then will run the application server on that server. So it will launch, it will have a defaulted port, and often it will ask you at that time to please enter your license. You can run it for limited parts just for testing and stuff, but it's very limited. It's going to ask you for your license that was provided from Alpha. So once you have that, then it's fully live and it exposes all the capabilities there. Now the tricky part, the next stop, and we might be able to do this in a future session just showing how this does, is that once it's running on that server, you need to make sure that you have selected the right port for the client side. And what a port is basically the server has a name. And the default port for web services is port 80. But the reality is, if that is a Windows server, it may already have IAS, which is Windows App Server, or Windows HTML server, may already have that port. So you may have to go into Alpha and say, no, I want it to be 8080 or 8090 or whatever port you want. And therefore, then when someone calls this server, you have to tell it what port you're going to go to, and that's the only other thing you have to do it. And the way you do that is on the server, you can actually click on, when it's running, it's in the sys tray down below. So it'll be showing up in this sys tree down right here. You open it up and then decide and restart the server, and from then on, it's listening to that port on that server. Now, one last little thing you need to worry about is that you need to, if it's not port 80, then you have to make sure that you have opened up in the Windows firewall that port. So let's take the scenario number one, or scenario where I've downloaded the exe from Alpha, I've double-clicked it, and it's installed the files on my server. I then run my app server, and it launches, and I say, you know what, I want it running on port 8080, just because I want to run other things on this server. You know, they may already be using it for something. And it doesn't have to be on a dedicated server, by the way. We recommend, you know, if you're going to have a lot of people hitting it, but it could be on a machine that you're already using for something else. So you designate port 8080, and therefore it's ready to go. The last step is you have to make sure that port 8080 in the Windows server is, the firewall is open, because otherwise the Windows Server firewall will block that traffic. So you just have to go, and there's tons of tutorials on the web. You basically open up the Windows firewall and you enable a rule that says allow HTTP traffic to enter on port 8080 of this server. So step one is download. Step two, install, which loads the files up. Step three, run the Alpha application server. At that point, adjust it as necessary, i.e. with any ports. And step four is verify that on the Windows server that the proper port has been open in the firewall. Otherwise, these clients will get, you know, it will just basically bounce off the firewall. It'll get rejected there. Once that firewall port is open, when this person makes that call, it will go through 8080. That gets routed right to the Alpha app server. It takes that traffic, munges it, and sends the information back from there. At that point, you're up and running. Everything else happens within the Alpha environment. and you're good to go.
Terrific. And if I could just add to that a bit, now that we also have the Alpha application server for IIS, what we're finding more and more is that corporations, especially larger corporations, but almost corporations of any size, especially if they have an IT department, will often find, well, this Alpha application server, I'm really not sure about it, but we do have a version of it that runs in conjunction with IIS. You can use the same port 80, and there's some benefits as well in terms of scaling, and we have covered this in previous webinars. So in the case of a corporate setup, especially when you're bringing an IT department in, you may want to look strongly at the Alpha application server for IIS. It's a little bit more to set up than simply installing an EXE, but we've made the process now more and more streamlined, so it isn't really that bad. So that would be my suggestion there. Next.
And your code's going to operate the same on both. I mean, it's
the
same
app server. Yep.
Installation and publishing is just a little different between the two, but once you're good to go, you're good to go.
Yep. Here's a question. This person knows about the submit button on a UX component, and they've been adding their own code to it to get it to do things. But they want to know, can I put multiple buttons right on a UX and have them perform different actions? And if so, could you just show us how that's done?
Absolutely. Let me go back to my development environment. I'll open up my UX. See if I have that one right there. Yep. So the submit button is kind of a special button, and all it's really doing is running a piece of JavaScript that says, okay, wrap up everything I have and send it back to the server. That's what all a submit button is doing. It's basically saying, okay, I want to go and put that from there. So if I look on here and I scroll down over here to define controls, I have a pre-made submit reset button. So I don't actually have to code it up myself. I can just click that. And you'll notice that the system immediately put two buttons on here, a submit button and a reset button. And they already have the name on them. You can rename them, etc. from there. But if I go to the submit button and I scroll down here to the click event, so this is the button right here. Here are all my properties on here. I can then just click on here and you'll see, heck, all it's doing is running a little piece of JavaScript that says dialog object.submit. And this, excuse me, wait a second. This tells the system or the UX to say, okay, go ahead and make a call back to the server and send it all the information you have on that. And you'll see you can even change a few information as you do from there. But that's kind of a defaulted button there. But if I want to add other behaviors, and there's no reason why I can't add my own buttons. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go over to my data controls, actually my other controls. And you'll notice down here I have something called button. So I'm going to click on there. And then I'm going to scroll over here. So you'll notice it put a button here. I'm going to give the text. I'm going to say hello. So that's going to just be the text of the button. Then I can make changes to this button. I can make it a hyperlink, an image, etc. Do a lot of modifications. But then down here, I can go to this click event. And you'll notice the difference is the submit button already was kind of pre-filled out. It was pre-canned. But in this situation, I have a click event where I want to say hello. So I click on this 3 ellipsis button here to add a behavior to this button. So I'm going to go up here. Now I'm opened up here in my action JavaScript section. If I wanted to just put some JavaScript on there, I could click text mode, go right into JavaScript. But I'm going to go to action JavaScript, and I'm going to click here. And for people who are new, action JavaScript is just an easy way to write some JavaScript without having to learn the whole dialect and everything else. As you can see, we have a very wide range of potential things. You can open other controls, you can do mapping, you can do import, export, you can do reports, just crazy amount of different stuff you can do it within there. And you use this filter list up here to search for it. As you can see, I have one up here called message box. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now that I've selected message box action JavaScript, it opens up a Genie. And in here, it gives me some options. So I'm going to say hello, okay? I have my buttons. I can have OK or OK cancel. And then it's a variable name is what I do. And then I also have the ability to do what's called an advanced message box, which allows you to do a bunch more cool stuff. But I'm going to keep it simple for today. And I click OK, and save. Okay. So let me go ahead and we'll go server. bear with you, I'm just going to sign it. So, okay, so now when I go in and do a working preview, you'll notice I have my text box, my submit and reset button, I have my say hello, I click there, and there it goes. Just throws up a box with a hello there, says okay. So you can add as many of these buttons you want, and you can use a mix of either Action JavaScript or you can use JavaScript directly. So if I go in here and I'm editing that button, and as you notice I used Action JavaScript, well, if I go over here to this button here called View JavaScript and click on it, check it out. It's just a simple alert command. So that Genie allowed me to write this JavaScript without having to know JavaScript. And the only thing that's going to run on the browser is JavaScript. That's the language that the web browser uses. But let me go ahead and edit this action real quick, and let's make this an advanced one, and then click OK. And now let's look at the JavaScript. You can see it's getting a little bit more complicated. Again, nothing very difficult to understand. You can actually, I could walk you through this in a few minutes. You'd understand what is going on there. But the important thing to realize is that the Action JavaScript really just is a Genie to allow you to write JavaScript, because that's the only thing. So it's going to translate anything we do in here into a set of JavaScript commands, and maybe some XBasic at server side to do stuff there. But the trick is just add a button using the button control from the other controls, then go to the click event, click there. It doesn't have to be the click event. It could be swipe up, swipe down on that device, number of different things there. And then you can add any and all kind of behaviors, so you could have a button that will submit, a button that will make some changes on the user interface. The sky's the limit as far as what you want to do with that. So that's how you would add other buttons onto a UX control and have them do other things.
Now, if you wanted to have multiple submits, for example, one just does a submit, but the other does submit and opens up something, one does a submit and displays a message box, can you simply just grab that code from the first submit and paste it into the other buttons?
Absolutely. I mean, I could just go ahead and create another submit reset. I'm not limited to one. I can have multiple there, kind of from there. Okay, it's going to give it a different unique ID, but I've now got this with all that original code, and then I can go in and make modifications on what happens when they click on it there. The question is, when the person clicks submit, remember the server-side event after dialog validate will run, and in here you can take actions. So you may want to wait till after the dialog is validated to take certain actions. So just realize that you have immediate ability to do things by adding a button, and then in the JavaScript you can do those pieces there. But also within the server side, once that goes over to the server, you can look at the information and also take some behaviors. So you kind of want to decide where you're going to do the work. So for instance, saving data to the database, you do that right here. Is that once it's been submitted, then you can put in your code, and actually it's just Action JavaScripting that will do the actual save command of the information that's in the form into the database after it's been validated. So that's how I'd approach that. And again, the other option you could have done is just taken this button, gone up here to menu, copy selected controls to the clipboard, and then click paste controls to the clipboard, and it would paste an exact duplicate of this, but it will change the ID of the button because every button has a different ID. So you'll notice this button ID here is button submit, and the new one I created here, you'll notice it said, oh no, I'm going to call that button submit 1.
Excellent. Another couple of questions. Here's a quick one. Does a UX component need to be placed on an A5W page, or can the UX component just be standalone?
That's a really good question. Is every UX component or components are entities that live on A5W pages, so you have to have at least one A5W web page in there. Now the cool thing, and it's shown with the tabbed UI, is that you really only need to have one A5W page, and then you can be loading controls dynamically into that same page. You don't have to have a page for every UX. So a good example of that is this. Excuse me. If this were my primary page in the application, I have to click up here and save page. And what this does is it basically saves a page and embeds this component on that page. Thus, it puts it on the server. So when the person calls it, they don't call a component directly. They actually call an A5W page, and then the A5W page looks on itself and says, oh, I have these components. I'm going to render them and show them to there. But the cool thing about it is that once you have it on there, I can do some pretty sophisticated stuff. So for instance, I can go on here to data controls. I'm sorry, other controls. I'm going to put a button, and I'm going to go down here to my action JavaScript for that button, and I'm going to click here, and I'm going to add a new action, and I'm going to open a grid component. And you'll notice it brings up a genie here, and I'm going to go ahead in this grid component is I'm going to select just any grid here. Let's say customer grid right here. And what I want to do is I'm going to have it show in a modal pop-up window, and I click OK. So all I want to do is when the person clicks on this, I want to open up a grid component. So you'll notice I haven't created a new A5W page. Basically, I have my UX here running. I click button, and it's going to open up a whole window on top of this, inside this control, with my grid. So the cool thing about that is I don't have to have like an A5W page for everything I build. I just need one as that primary host for it. And to get even more sophisticated, you can use, and I'm not going to go through here, but you can use panels to set up panel controls so you can have information shown and hide. So I could have a panel, I could have a layout where I could have 3 or 4 embedded controls on this same UX on one A5W page. So a bit long-winded answer, but the answer is yes, you absolutely have to have a A5W page, which is the initial starting point, but using the more modern techniques, you can have basically a single-page application where everything else happens within the master control or those pieces there. So that's just a quick and dirty kind of representation of A5W pages and the master control, and then controls.
Now, there is one exception, I believe, to that, and that is if you are building an application that's a mobile application and you'll be using PhoneGap as the way to distribute that as opposed to having it accessible on the web. I believe in PhoneGap, the settings are such that you don't point to an A5W page, but directly to that component. So yeah, I guess that's the one tiny exception to that, but 99% of the time, yes, it needs to be wrapped up inside a page. And even when you're working at it, you're looking at it in working preview and live preview, behind the scenes Alpha is creating an A5W page for you so that it does work.
Right. And to reinforce that is, for instance, this is that template for a mobile app, and you'll notice that I have like a first panel card which has my login information, but then once I've logged in, my content is going to actually be in my second panel card. So I don't go to another A5W page. Basically, this panel card disappears and this one shows, and the rest of my application runs right within this right there. So the powerful thing is once you've created that one single A5W page, you're good. If it's PhoneGap, it's just going to take this this UX component, wrap it in a PhoneGap, and you don't even need an A5W page, as David mentioned.
Here's a question, and one that we won't necessarily be able to answer in the remaining 6 or 7 minutes, but that is, other than saying yes, which is, do you support saving data on the client side? It may be in a database like SQLite on a mobile device.
Yes, the answer is you can do that now. Specifically, you can add that. There are JavaScript libraries that allow you to interact with a local database that are doing there, but that would be all kind of not built into Alpha, meaning that you could add the JavaScript and whatever the libraries are you need to do that database, and then include it with an Alpha app, and then insert the JavaScript on there. So it's really a manual step for you to do it, but there's absolutely your way to do it. Now, where we're seeing more and more of that is we're seeing requests for people who build PhoneGap apps to be able to have local databases. So right now we take and put JSON data, and it's all handled by Alpha, but we've seen some people who are doing some pretty radical stuff, so they really want to have an actual database on the mobile device. And that's part of our roadmap for this next year, is that we'll be including support to be able to save your data into a local database that's still in very early stages, but that's on our roadmap to be able to allow you in a PhoneGap app to have a local database. The challenges you have, if you're doing like a web browser, there's only so much the web browser allows you to do, because it's not really meant to be a desktop app. It gives you a certain amount of data and other restrictions on the file system and everything else for security standpoints. So there's certain limitations there. But when we start talking about PhoneGap and building PhoneGap apps, we're you can include your own JavaScript libraries, your own capabilities to do that, and down the road we're going to be adding support for that as part of the Alpha roadmap.
And there's a lot more of the answer that we just wouldn't have time to get to today, but there are things to look into. For example, we have something called a data cache, which is meant to hold data for offline use. We have a way of storing data right in the DOM and allowing you to keep. So even if it's a web application that isn't using PhoneGap, when you lose connection, it's actually stored right in the web page and is not refreshed until it's resynced. So you actually have quite a lot of information available about all the different techniques for handling offline data. It's a really important concept to us and something we've spent an awful lot of time working on. We're also working with Couch and Pouch DB as well to store data. So if you do have a specific question about that, if you have an application in mind and you want to say, okay, what does Alpha have in terms of handling storing the data on the client side, send an email over to guides@alphasoftware.com and I can put you in touch with the right people and also send you over the links to the documents that we have created on this. But we do a lot of stuff with offline right now.
And yeah, and that's the interesting thing is that Alpha really is focused on providing the richness and the power of desktop application behaviors and capabilities in a web environment, whether it's a connected web environment or a disconnected web environment. And the cool thing about that is it's sort of like chocolate in my peanut butter and peanut butter in my chocolate in terms of when you get all those pieces working together, you're going to be able to create world-class desktop-like apps that run in the web through web delivery. So you get all the advantages of being connected through the web and delivery, maintenance, support, but you don't sacrifice a lot of the capabilities that you had on the desktop. And it's happening very, very quickly. And a key area of that is just what happens when you're disconnected from the primary server. How do you continue to operate? And that's where Alpha is spending a lot of engineering effort, time, and dollars to really make that transparent for our developers. So we have to spend less time thinking about that and more time thinking about the functionality we want to deliver to our end users.
Great. So another question we have back on the server side is, will Alpha Anywhere, and not the IIS version, be shipped as an installable service instead of an EXE, and why is it delivered as an EXE? And the answer is that we don't have immediate plans to make it as an installable service right out of the box. However, it has been made safe to run as a service. So we do have instructions on our website and at wiki.alphasoftware.com, which explain how to run Alpha Anywhere as a service. And like I said, it has been made safe, so it doesn't display error messages to the console and things like that services are not allowed to do. The other thing that most people have been running right now is, or a lot of people have been using, is a product called Always Up, which gives you which allows Alpha to run as a service, but also provides monitoring and a whole bunch of other really, really helpful things. I think it costs there's one-time purchase fee of $50 for the server. Highly recommend that. But if you do have questions about server setup, by all means send an email over to guides@alphasoftware.com. And let's see, we have about 1 minute. Let me see if I can find a quick question. We may not have a quick one. Nope, not quick, not quick. We have several really great questions that I don't think we'll be able to get to. We'll get them. Yeah, I'll send them over to you, Dan, and then we can talk about them. Just a quick question, and actually, now that I've got people here, I would like to see a show of hands. This is a feature we haven't used before, but GoToWebinar supports this. Over at your, I think, Attendees tab. Nope, over at the side, at the side of your GoToWebinar control panel, you should see something that looks like a little hand. And so first of all, I want to see does this feature work. Would you guys mind pressing that raise your hand button? I just want to see if it's working.
The only thing I see is it has too many fingers extended. I'm not used to seeing it that way.
Far too many fingers. All right, I'm not seeing hands here. Oh yeah, no, well, I'm seeing a whole bunch. Okay, great. So a lot of people are here and paying attention. Great. All right, I'm going to put your hands down. So just a quick question. We do have one suggestion here for someone who'd like to see a webinar about how you could integrate purchased CSS styles, so I suppose things like Bootstrap and things like that, into your application, to give them a really super sharp look and feel. Just from a show of hands, how many other people, and I think it'll be a lot, how many other people would be interested in seeing a webinar like that one? So, wow, yeah, like 1 million people. Okay, so
Yeah.
Dan, we'll need to cover that. So thank you very much for your suggestion.
That's the point where you go, hey, this new paid webinar.
I think we can.
Raise your hand with your credit card in hand, and we'll be glad. No.
Oh, look, all the hands went down, Dion. How did that happen?
Yeah, I know. What's that, cheap bastard?
All right,
Sorry.
great.
Have to blank that up.
All right. Anyway, thank you very much. It was great seeing you all back after the vacation break. Thank you very much for attending. We have come to the end of our time. If you do have questions that you would like us to get to next time, send the guides to uides@alphasoftware.com. We'll also mine through the questions that we didn't get to this time around. So thanks again. Thank you, Dion. And we hope to see you next week. Take care and have a great week. Bye-bye.